500 feet down, sealed in a steel chamber for 28 days, something knocked on the hull, 3 times, evenly spaced, from outside. There were no divers in the water, the bell was docked. And at that depth, the only thing that can survive in the kind of cold, black pressure out there is not something with knuckles. The company logged it, then buried it. But I was inside the chamber when it happened. And I haven't worked a saturation bell since. My name is Christopher, and for 11 years I didn't just dive the North Sea. I lived at the bottom of it. 28 days per rotation, sealed inside a pressurized steel chamber no bigger than a cargo van, breathing a helium-oxygen mix that makes your voice sound like a demonic cartoon. At 500 feet, the outside water temperature hovers just above freezing, and the only thing separating you from instant death is a welded hull and 12 millimeters of steel. Saturation diving pays 6 figures because the occupational fatality rate is 40 times the national average. I accepted that risk the day I certified. What I didn't accept was what happened inside the chamber when no one was in the water. The company called it thermal expansion. The expert report said it wasn't, and the hydrophone recordings they refused to release contain a pattern that spans 9 years. I'm going to tell you about the rotation that ended my career. It wasn't the longest one I'd done, and it wasn't the deepest. It was supposed to be routine. 8th job on the Alba field, about 120 miles northeast of Aberdeen, doing pipeline inspection and structural repair on a subsea manifold that had been installed back when I was still in elementary school. Water depth, 158 meters. That's 518 feet. The pressure at that depth is 16.5 atmospheres, enough to crush a steel drum like a soda can if you took the air out of it. The chamber we lived in was rated to 300 meters, so we had margin. But margin doesn't feel like safety when you're inside it. The hull was 2-inch rolled steel, and it creaked constantly as the pressure differential shifted with the tide. You learn to ignore the creaks. You learn to ignore a lot of things, but not the knocks. There were 3 of us on that rotation. A Norwegian kid named Lars who couldn't have been older than 25, and a veteran Scottish diver named Doogie who'd been sat diving since before I was born. Doogie had the 1,000-yard stare you see on guys who have spent too many cumulative months at depth. He talked about decompression sickness, the way other men talk about the weather. He'd had 3 hits already, one of them spinal, and he was still working because the money was too good and he had 2 ex-wives and a daughter in university. Lars was fresh meat, bright-eyed. He'd read all the manuals, memorized the decompression tables, and thought he was prepared. None of the manuals mention what happens when something knocks on the hull from the outside when you're alone at 500 feet. They don't teach that in the Commercial Diving Academy in Dunoon. Our chamber complex sat on the deck of a semi-submersible platform called the Alpha Dancer. 3 chambers, actually. The main living habitat, a transfer lock to the diving bell, and the bell itself, which could be lowered to the work site. Once we compressed to depth on day 1, we were married to that pressure for 28 days. The air we breathed was 98% helium and 2% oxygen, because at that depth nitrogen becomes a narcotic so powerful you'd be unconscious in minutes. The helium makes your voice so high-pitched that communication topside requires an unscrambler. It also makes you lose body heat 6 times faster than normal, so the chamber was kept at around 32 degrees Celsius, just to keep us from hypothermia. Add the constant humidity from 4 men breathing recycled gas, the inability to shower because water doesn't flow properly under pressure, and the fact that you are eating, sleeping, and using a chemical toilet 6 feet from 2 other men, and you have a decent approximation of what a 2-month prison sentence in a sensory deprivation tank feels like. And that's before anything goes wrong. Every 12 hours, 2 of us would suit up and transfer into the bell for a 6-hour work shift on the seafloor. The 3rd diver stayed in the habitat as the standby, monitoring comms and life support. It was monotonous physical work, welding in the dark, freezing water with thousands of pounds of steel pipe above you. The umbilical hose is your lifeline. It carries your breathing gas, your hot water for the suit, your communications cable, and your video feed back to the control room. If that hose gets snagged and severed, You've got about 5 minutes of emergency bailout gas before you drown or freeze or both. In 2012, a diver at 90 meters had his umbilical cut on a steel platform and survived after 33 minutes without breathing gas because of the emergency reserves and a fast rescue. Most don't get that lucky. I knew a guy who died in '99, his umbilical pinned under a section of fallen pipe. They pulled him up to the bell 2 hours later. My point is, the work is lethal even when everything works right. So when something happens that doesn't fit the known list of lethal hazards, your brain short circuits. It doesn't know how to process the threat. Your training covers failed seals, gas contamination, fire, flooding, explosive decompression. It does not cover something knocking on the hull with intent. It was day 9. I know the date because I'd been counting the days down obsessively on a whiteboard in the habitat. We just finished the evening shift and were all three in the main chamber dockside. The bell was secured to the transfer lock, no one was outside. Lars was playing cards with Doogie. I was reading a paperback I'd read 3 times already because there's only so much entertainment you can pack into a dry bag that fits through a pressure hatch. And then it happened. 3 impacts. Low, resonant, evenly spaced. Like someone striking the outside of the hull with a heavy mallet. Bang. Pause. Bang. Pause. Bang. The sound carried through the steel and vibrated through the atmosphere inside so you felt it in your teeth. Doogie dropped his cards. Lars went white. I looked at the depth gauge like it would somehow explain what I'd just heard. The first thing you do is run the checklist. We called topside. The dive supervisor, a man named Henderson who I'd worked with on 3 previous jobs, confirmed what we already knew. No divers in the water, the bell was docked, no ROV deployed, no vessel movement in the vicinity. The hydrophone system was passive at the moment, but the impact had been strong enough to register on the structural monitoring sensors. Henderson said it was probably a piece of debris, a loose pipe section settling on the seafloor nearby. He sounded calm. He was always calm. That's his job. Ours was to sit tight and try to sleep knowing that something 6 feet from our heads, on the other side of 2 inches of steel, had just made an intentional series of knocks at 500 feet. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Lars. Doogie tried, but I heard him muttering something about the Byford Dolphin. In 1983, on that rig, a chamber clamp was released a fraction of a second too soon while the diving bell was still pressurized to 9 atmospheres. The explosive decompression killed 5 men instantly. One of them was pushed through a 12-inch opening. We all carry that story in the back of our heads. It's the worst-case scenario. It happened because of human error and missing safety interlocks. What happened to us had no explanation. And that's worse because you can't fix what you can't diagnose. The knocks didn't stop. That's the thing that would break us. Not a single unexplained event, but the fact that it came back. And when I tell you what the hydrophone actually recorded, and what the company's own expert later wrote in a footnote buried on page 74 of the incident report, you'll understand why I haven't set foot on a saturation platform since. The next 2 days were silent. That silence was almost worse. Every creak of the hull, every shift of the ballast system made me flinch. Lars stopped sleeping entirely. He just sat on his bunk staring at the pressure gauge like he was waiting for the needle to swing. Doogie tried to laugh it off. He said we'd all been breathing too much helium and our brains were boiling. But I noticed he was the first one to ask Henderson for a hydrophone playback on day 10. He wanted to hear what the sensors had actually recorded. Henderson said he'd check with the data crew. He didn't sound optimistic. Day 11, the knocks came again. Same rhythm, same intensity. This time I was the one who called it in. The instant the first impact hit, I had my hand on the comms panel. Henderson acknowledged. He still insisted it was environmental. Thermal stress in the steel, he said. The hull frames expand and contract with pressure changes, and sometimes they release stored energy in sudden pops. I'd heard that explanation before. It makes sense on paper. But thermal expansion doesn't sound like a deliberate strike. It sounds like a groan or a snap. This was a knock, 3 knocks, evenly spaced, precision you could set a metronome to, and it came from the exact same section of hull, frame 47, port side lower quadrant, near where the bell mating skirt connected. I knew that because after the first incident, I'd asked for the structural sensor data. I'm not an engineer, but I'd spent enough time in those chambers to read the basic location output. When I told Henderson it was the same frame, he went quiet for a second. Then he said, "We'll log it." That word, log it, the corporate reflex. Document the anomaly, file it, move on. Because the alternative was halting a multi-million-dollar operation to investigate something that, by all known physics, couldn't exist and posed no immediate structural threat. I understood his position. That didn't make me feel safer. It made me feel like a data point. Day 14 was the third event. This time it happened during a shift change. Doogie and I were suiting up in the transfer lock when the knocks came. In the lock, you're more exposed. The steel is thinner there and the acoustics are sharper. I heard it not just through the hull but through my boots. The vibrations traveled up my spine. Doogie froze with his helmet half on. We locked eyes. Neither of us said a word. Then we did what we were paid to do. We completed the dive. We descended in the Bell, worked 6 hours on a flange repair in total darkness, and tried to pretend the chamber we had to return to wasn't waiting for us with an unsolvable question. The worst part of saturation diving isn't the cold or the pressure or the constant hum of the life support systems. It's that you can't leave. Not quickly. Decompression from 150 meters takes 5 full days. Every minute of those 5 days, you're still locked in the same steel tube, breathing the same recycled gas with the same 2 people. So when something starts happening that scares you on a primal level, you can't run. You can't open a door and walk away. You are sealed inside with that fear, and it marinates. After day 14, we held a meeting. Just the 3 of us, no topside on the comms. Doogie said he didn't believe in ghosts. Lars said he did. I said I didn't care what it was. I wanted to know if it had been recorded. The chamber had a hull-mounted hydrophone array that fed into the topside data system. That array recorded everything: ambient sea noise, tool impacts during dives, communications chatter. It would have captured the knocks in full fidelity. I asked Henderson for a copy of the recording. He said he'd put in a request. I understood at that moment that I'd never hear it voluntarily. The company wasn't going to hand me evidence of something they couldn't explain, but the recording existed, and they couldn't erase it because the data logs were automatically backed up to a secure server on shore in Aberdeen. What I didn't know then was that those logs contained far more than 3 isolated incidents from our rotation. They contained a pattern spanning nearly a decade. And the pattern was so precise, so mathematically improbable, that the company's own acoustics expert would eventually write a footnote admitting that it could not be explained by any natural or mechanical phenomenon they understood. I wouldn't learn that for another year. First, I had to survive the remaining days. Day 19. We'd had 4 days of quiet. Lars started to believe it was over. He was almost cheerful, talking about the leave he'd take after the rotation, a girl back in Stavanger. Then the knocks came again and he shattered. It was the same 3 strikes, but this time there was something different, a 4th impact. Softer, almost tentative, like a hesitation, like something was testing the hull. That was the moment I realized we weren't dealing with a random physical phenomenon. Whatever was out there was responding. It had established a pattern, and now it was varying the pattern. That requires intent, or at least it suggests a decision was made, and decisions require a mind. Lars didn't just panic, he broke. He started screaming into the comms for Henderson to bring us up to start decompression immediately. Henderson tried to calm him down, explaining what we all knew. You can't just pop to the surface from 16 atmospheres. The nitrogen equivalent, even with helium, requires a controlled ascent. If you surface too fast, the dissolved gas in your tissues bubbles out of solution like opening a shaken soda can. Your blood fizzes. You die in agony. 5 days minimum, no exceptions. Lars didn't accept that. He tried to manually cycle the transfer lock to the Bell as if he could somehow launch himself to the surface alone. Doogie restrained him. It wasn't pretty. Lars was a big kid and he was fueled by pure terror. We got him on his bunk, but he kept struggling, kept begging, kept saying he could feel something waiting outside the hull. He said he could hear it breathing. I didn't hear breathing. But I sure as hell didn't tell him he was imagining it. We called the medic. The platform had a hyperbaric doctor on standby, standard for saturation operations. He made the call to sedate Lars. There was no other option. A diver in acute psychological crisis at depth is a danger to himself and everyone in the chamber. So they dosed him with a sedative cocktail that kept him in a twilight state for the remainder of the rotation. He wasn't unconscious, but he wasn't fully present either. He'd lie there, eyes open, mumbling about the knocks, about something walking around the hull, about how it knew we were inside and was waiting for us to come out because it couldn't get in. The things he said in that sedated state were worse than the knocks themselves, because he spoke with absolute certainty, the way a person speaks when they've seen something undeniable. Day 22 was the day we should have decompressed. Instead, we still had 6 more days of work scheduled. The company made the call to extend the rotation because of the flange repair delays. I protested. So did Doogie. Henderson said the client had penalty clauses. We said Lars was sedated in his bunk. Henderson said the sedation was being monitored and he was medically stable. I told him we weren't. He said he understood. Nothing changed. The knocks came one more time before we finally began decompression on day 25. Day 23, the last one. Same 3 strikes. Same frame 47. I didn't bother calling it in. I just sat there, listening, counting the seconds between impacts. 3.2 seconds between the first and second. 3.2 seconds between the second and third. A rhythm that never varied. Not by a tenth of a second, not by 100th. I'd later learn from the expert report that it was consistent within 40 milliseconds across years. But even then, in that chamber, I knew. I was hearing something that wasn't random, something that was keeping time. When decompression finally started on day 25, the slow ascent through the pressure gradients felt like a countdown to freedom. 5 days, the chamber pressure decreasing by fractions of an atmosphere per hour, the helium being scrubbed, nitrogen being reintroduced. Lars was brought out of sedation on day 27. He didn't speak. He didn't look at us. He just stared at the whole frame where the knocks had come from, and he didn't blink for what felt like an hour. The moment the hatch opened on the surface, he walked off the platform without a word. He didn't collect his gear. He didn't sign his discharge papers. He just left. I never saw him again. I finished the rotation. I signed the documents. I took my pay. And the first thing I did when I got back to Aberdeen was submit a formal request for the hydrophone recordings from our chamber, frame 47, all shifts, the full 28 days. The company responded 2 weeks later. They declined. Stated reason: the recordings contained proprietary operational data and were not releasable under the terms of my contract. I hired a maritime solicitor. He sent a letter. The company sent back a thicker one, full of non-disclosure clauses and liability waivers I'd apparently signed during my initial employment 9 years earlier. They were willing to go to court. I didn't have the money for that fight, not against a multi-billion-dollar energy corporation. So I let it go. At least, I thought I let it go. Then a year later, Lars filed a civil suit against the company for psychological injury and negligent infliction of emotional distress. His lawyers subpoenaed the hydrophone logs from the Alpha Dancer, and what came out of that disclosure process was the footnote. I got a call from Lars's solicitor. He said, "You need to read the expert report, specifically the appendices." I asked why. He said, "Because the knocking wasn't just on your rotation. It's been recorded on 11 separate rotations across 9 years. Same hull frame, same field, same rhythm, and the expert says it's not thermal expansion." I'll never forget the next thing he told me. The interval between knocks is consistent to within 40 milliseconds, over 9 years. The expert wrote that this level of temporal precision is, quote, "not characteristic of thermal expansion or any known environmental stress phenomenon. It is suggestive of a deliberate signal." Deliberate. Signal. Those 2 words changed everything. Because if the knocks were deliberate, then something out there was not just aware of the chamber. It was aware of us, and it had been calling for 9 years without anyone answering. The solicitor sent me the expert report the next day. It was 112 pages, bound in a plain blue cover with the company's letterhead discreetly tucked in the corner. Most of it was technical jargon, acoustic impedance profiles, spectral analysis graphs, structural resonance modeling, the kind of document designed to be impenetrable to anyone without an engineering doctorate. But the summary on page 3 was clear enough, and the footnote on page 74 was the only thing that mattered. The report was authored by a Dr. Alan Crossley, a forensic acoustician with 30 years of experience in subsea structural analysis. He'd been retained by the company to determine whether the hull impacts recorded on the Alpha Dancer posed any risk to operational safety. His conclusion: no immediate structural risk. The impacts were low energy, non-damaging, and did not compromise hull integrity. Case closed, except for one section where he analyzed the temporal pattern of the impacts. He'd isolated 17 separate 3-knock events from the hydrophone logs, spanning 11 distinct rotations between 2003 and 2012. 9 years. Every event originated from the same acoustic source point, frame 47, port side lower quadrant, within a 1-meter radius of the bell mating skirt. Every event consisted of exactly 3 impacts, and the interval between impacts, measured from the onset of the first to the onset of the second, and from the second to the third, was 1,842 milliseconds. Every time. Across 9 years, across 17 events, that interval never varied by more than 40 milliseconds. 40 milliseconds. That's less than the latency of a human blink. Crossley wrote in his main analysis that the consistency was anomalous but not determinative. He suggested it could theoretically result from a repeating mechanical stress cycle in the hull frame, perhaps a stuck valve actuator or a thermal expansion joint that had seized in a specific configuration. But then came the footnote. I read it so many times I memorized it. It should be noted that the observed temporal uniformity is not characteristic of thermal expansion, which typically exhibits random interval distributions due to variable heating rates and material inhomogeneity. Nor is it consistent with known biological sources, which lack the mechanical precision observed here. The possibility of anthropogenic origin from within the platform was considered and excluded after a full audit of all deck machinery and ROV activity during the relevant time windows. The signal characteristics most closely resemble a deliberate, mechanically generated acoustic pulse of unknown origin. No further conclusions are drawn in this report. Unknown origin. Deliberate. Those words were stamped in black ink on company letterhead. The company's own expert had basically said, something intelligent made these knocks and we don't know what it was, and they buried that admission in a footnote. I called Lars's solicitor back. I wanted to know everything. He told me the case had been brutal. The company fought every disclosure motion, every deposition, every request for expert testimony. They spent more on lawyers than any settlement could possibly cost, which didn't make sense unless the settlement itself was the goal. If they'd wanted to win, they could have litigated. The employment contracts were ironclad. The waivers covered psychological injury, but they didn't litigate. They settled. Full confidentiality. Lars got a payment that would keep him comfortable for the rest of his life, with a non-disclosure agreement so restrictive he couldn't even tell his own mother what happened. The company didn't want a public record. They didn't want discovery. They didn't want Crossley on a witness stand under oath, being asked to explain what could produce an acoustic signal with that level of precision at 500 feet. Because the answer, if he were honest, would be that nothing known to science can do that. And once that statement enters a public court record, the story doesn't disappear. I started digging on my own. I reached out to other divers I'd worked with over the years. Quiet calls off the record. Most hung up on me. A few admitted they'd heard things. Strange acoustics on night shifts, a thump that didn't belong, a vibration that felt wrong. No one had heard the exact 3-knock pattern, but the discomfort was universal. One guy, a bell operator I'd worked with in 2006, told me something I've never been able to forget. He said that on the Alba field there was a superstition among the older crew. They called it the timekeeper. No one could explain where the name came from or who started it. But it was understood that if you were on a particular platform, on a particular chamber, and you heard 3 evenly spaced knocks, you didn't talk about it. You didn't log it. You just acknowledged it and moved on, because nothing good came from asking too many questions about the deep. That's when I realized this wasn't about one rotation or one chamber. The company had been aware of this phenomenon for at least 9 years, possibly longer. The hydrophone logs went back to the commissioning of the Alpha Dancer in 1998. How many three-knock events were in those early years? The expert report only analyzed the period from 2003 onward because that's when the digital recording system was upgraded. Before that, the data was stored on magnetic tape, and most of it had been lost or degaussed according to the company's discovery responses. Convenient. So the real timeline could have been 15 years. 15 years of something knocking on the hull at frame 47, in the dark, in the cold, in the most hostile environment on the planet, and no one had ever mentioned it to the men living inside that chamber. I asked the solicitor if there was any way to get the full hydrophone recordings. He said no. The settlement agreement covered all sensor data, and the company had successfully argued that releasing it would compromise proprietary operational methodology. That's legalese for, we don't want you to hear what we heard, and we have enough money to make sure you never do. But the expert report was technically an exhibit in the pretrial discovery, and while the settlement sealed most of it, the footnote had already been referenced in a preliminary ruling that was technically public record. An obscure maritime law journal had published the ruling, footnote, and all. I found it in a university library database. Page had been accessed 3 times in the last decade. I was one of the 3. Reading the ruling, I learned something else. The company had conducted an internal investigation after the first couple of logged events in 2003. They'd sent an ROV down to frame 47 to do a visual inspection. The ROV footage was referenced in the documents. It showed nothing. No damage, no debris, no marine growth, no indication of impact at all. The steel was clean. The paint was intact. There was no physical evidence that anything had ever touched the hull at that location. Yet the hydrophone recordings continued, year after year, rotation after rotation. Something was transmitting acoustic energy into the steel without leaving a mark. That's not how physics works. An impact that registers on structural sensors should leave a scratch, a dent, a stress mark. But frame 47 was pristine. The energy was being delivered without mechanical deformation. The only way to do that is if the source of the sound wasn't hitting the hull at all. It was generating pressure waves in the water directly, and the hull was just receiving them. A sound projector, a sonar pulse, a signal. Crossley almost admitted as much in the expert report. He noted that the acoustic signature was consistent with a narrow-band impulsive source rather than a broad-band mechanical impact. In plain English, it sounded more like a ping than a knock. A ping designed to resemble a knock, maybe so that human ears would interpret it as something familiar, something tapping on the door. But if it was a signal, then the question isn't what made it. The question is who was it for, and who sent the answer. I didn't sleep well after reading that. I still don't. Because the thing about a signal is that it implies a sender. And the thing about a sender at 500 feet in the North Sea is that there are only 2 options. Either it's human technology placed there deliberately, operating without the knowledge of the platform crew, which would mean some branch of government or military had been running a secret acoustic experiment under an oil field for a decade. Or it's not human, and it's been knocking for 9 years, waiting to see if anything inside that steel tube would knock back. Lars tried to knock back once. He didn't tell me this during the rotation. I learned it from the deposition his solicitor shared with me, heavily redacted. On day 12, after the second event when Doogie and I were in the Bell on a dive, Lars was alone in the habitat. He'd brought a wrench from the tool locker and struck the interior of the hull at frame 47, 3 times, evenly spaced. He was trying to communicate. He didn't tell us because he thought we'd think he was crazy. 10 seconds after his third strike, the reply came. 3 knocks from outside. Same rhythm, same intensity, but the interval had changed. It was faster now. 1,200 milliseconds instead of 1,800. Something out there had heard him and it had adjusted its tempo to match his. That was in the deposition, under oath. Lars broke down describing it. He said it felt like a conversation. A conversation where he didn't understand the words but understood perfectly the meaning. I am here. You are there. We know each other now. And that's when he started screaming for topside to bring us up. The company knew about this. They had the recordings of Lars's wrench strikes and the response. It was all on the hydrophone logs. Henderson must have heard it live. The control room must have monitored it in real time. And they did nothing. They told us it was thermal stress. They sedated a man who had just made first contact with something unknown. They extended the rotation for 6 more days. They exposed us to something that was actively responding to human interaction, and they didn't even warn us. I've spent the last several years trying to understand why. The answer, I think, is simpler than any conspiracy. It was money. The Alba field generates millions of pounds of revenue per day. Halting operations for an investigation would cost millions in downtime. Moving the platform's drilling schedule would cost more. Admitting that an unexplained acoustic phenomenon exists at the site would trigger regulatory inquiries, environmental impact studies, insurance reviews. It would open the door to questions no energy company wants to answer. So they did what corporations do. They logged it, they buried it, they paid off the one diver who fought back. They hoped the others would just walk away and forget. I did walk away, but I didn't forget. I still have dreams about the chamber, not nightmares exactly. Just the sensation of being sealed inside something, listening to the creak of the steel, waiting for 3 knocks that I know will come. In the dream, I'm always alone. Doogie and Lars are gone. The comms are dead. The pressure gauge reads 0, which means the hull has breached and the water should be flooding in, but it isn't. It's just dark. And then the knocks come. 1, 2, 3. And this time I have a wrench in my hand, and I'm raising it toward the hull, and I always wake up before I strike. The real horror of saturation diving isn't the thing that knocked. It's not the unexplained pattern or the company's cover-up. It's the 5 days of decompression after you've heard something you can't explain. 5 days of sitting in that same chamber, breathing that same heliox, staring at the same steel wall, knowing that something out there knows you're in here. And you can't leave. You can't run. You can't do anything except wait and listen and count the seconds between knocks and wonder if this is the rotation where the next knock will be inside. I left saturation diving after that rotation. Not immediately, not the moment the hatch opened. I was too exhausted, too chemically imbalanced from weeks of helium and recycled terror to make life decisions in that state. But within 3 months, I'd handed in my notice. My supervisor said I was walking away from the peak earning years of my career. I told him my career had peaked on day 19 of a rotation when a 25-year-old Norwegian kid tried to tear through a pressure hatch with his bare hands because something outside had changed the rhythm of its knocking. I didn't mention the wrench. I didn't mention that Lars had knocked back. The company already knew, and they'd never told me. That was the detail I couldn't move past. Not the knocking itself, the fact that they let us stay down there, sealed in a tube with something that was actively responding, and they told us it was thermal expansion. I couldn't work for people who'd make that call, so I walked. The first year on land was disorienting. Saturation diving rewires your body. You're used to the constant hum of scrubbers, the weight of pressure on your sinuses, the unnatural warmth of helium breathing. Silence becomes suspicious. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, convinced I'd heard 3 knocks on the bedroom wall. My wife would find me standing in the dark with my hand pressed against the plaster, counting seconds. She was patient. She'd read the medical literature on post-deployment stress in commercial divers. She knew the statistics. 85% of North Sea divers who survived their careers still suffered from decompression-related illness. 30% had measurable brain injury, and nearly all of them carried some form of psychological scarring. But what I had wasn't in the literature. It wasn't decompression sickness or bone necrosis or pulmonary damage. It was the certainty that something in the Alba field had been trying to talk to us, and we'd sedated the only man who tried to answer. I tried to reach Lars after the settlement. His solicitor told me he'd moved to a small town in northern Norway, somewhere above the Arctic Circle where the sun doesn't set for 2 months in summer and doesn't rise for 2 months in winter. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to be found. The settlement had given him enough to disappear, and he'd taken it. I respected that. But I still wanted to know what he'd heard in those response knocks, what it felt like to realize you were in a conversation with something unknown at 500 feet. The deposition only captured fragments. His solicitor had said that when Lars described the adjusted tempo, the knocks that came faster, matching his own, he stopped speaking for 30 seconds and just stared at the wall. Then he said, "It wasn't copying me. It was correcting me. Like I'd gotten the rhythm wrong and it was showing me how to do it properly." That detail stayed with me, because if the pattern was a language, then changing the tempo was like adjusting grammar. A deliberate modification to teach the proper form. That's not animal behavior. That's not sonar interference. That's a pedagogy. Something out there had a specific rhythm it wanted repeated, and when Lars got it wrong, it demonstrated the correct version. Over 9 years, across 17 events, the rhythm had been 1,842 milliseconds. Lars had knocked faster. The response had come at 1,200 milliseconds, showing him a different tempo. But neither of those were the original, because the original, the one that had been happening for 9 years, was always the slower one. So what was the faster one? An alternative, a next step. Or was the response to Lars actually the true rhythm, and all those prior knocks had been a simplified call, a beacon waiting for someone smart enough to deviate and prove they were listening? I couldn't answer that question alone, so I started looking for Doogie. The old Scottish diver had more cumulative hours at depth than anyone I'd ever met. If there was a deeper history to the knocks, he might know it. It took me 8 months to track him down. He wasn't dead, as I'd half feared. He was living in a council flat in Dundee on disability, his spine partially fused from a decompression hit that had finally ended his career. We sat in his kitchen and I told him about the expert report, the footnote, the 9 years of recordings. He listened without surprise. When I finished, he poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a chipped mug and said, I heard them, not just on our rotation. I heard them in '97, year before the Alpha Dancer even started drilling." I felt the room shift. "That's impossible," I said. "The platform wasn't commissioned until '98. The chamber wasn't even built." Doogie nodded. "The platform wasn't, but the survey work was. They sent down a subsea habitat for geological assessment 6 months before construction. 3 of us lived in a temporary chamber at the same depth, same location. And one night 3 knocks on the hull, same as you described. We reported it. The survey company said it was seismic testing interference, but there was no seismic work scheduled that week. And when the Alpha Dancer was commissioned a year later, I got a job on it. First rotation, day 3, 3 knocks. Same frame, same rhythm. I knew then it wasn't interference." He'd never told anyone. He'd made a calculation, report it again, get labeled as unreliable, lose the highest paying job in the North Sea. So he'd stayed quiet for 15 years, through dozens of rotations, always listening, always waiting. He'd heard the knocks on at least 7 separate occasions. He'd mapped the intervals in his head, and he'd noticed something that the expert report hadn't caught because the expert didn't have 15 years of personal observation. The knocks weren't just consistent. They were gradually slowing down, by fractions of a millisecond per year, imperceptible unless you were measuring across a decade. But Doogie had been. He said it felt like something that had been calling for a very long time and was getting tired. Or maybe it was getting old. Or maybe it was just slowing its tempo to see if we'd speed up to match, to prove we were paying attention enough to notice the drift. I asked Doogie if he'd ever knocked back. He went quiet, then he said, "Once, in 2004. I was alone in the bell waiting for the shift change. The knocks came. I hit the hull 3 times with a spanner, and nothing. No response. I thought maybe I'd scared it off. But then 2 hours later, when I was back in the habitat, the knocks came again. But different, not 3 knocks, 4. The same 4-knock pattern your Norwegian boy heard. I'd been the first one to answer, and it had changed the sequence. Not for me, for the next person who tried. It had learned, and it was waiting to see what we'd do next." That was the detail that broke the whole thing open for me. The knocks weren't just a repeating signal. They were an evolving one. Something out there was adapting its behavior based on human response. It had started with 3 knocks for years, maybe decades. Then Doogie knocked in 2004 and got no immediate reply, but 2 hours later, the response came, and it included a fourth knock, a new element. Then Lars knocked 8 years later, and the response not only included the fourth knock but adjusted the tempo to match his. The signal was growing more complex with every interaction, like a conversation that was slowly building vocabulary, and the company had been recording it the entire time, logging every iteration, while telling the men inside the chamber that it was just the hull settling. I don't know what's down there. I've spent 10 years trying to find an answer that fits within the world I understand. Sonar tests from unknown military submarines, acoustic interference from deep-sea mining equipment, thermal vent activity generating rhythmic pressure pulses. None of it explains the adaptive behavior. None of it explains why the knocks only happen when humans are inside the chamber, which I later confirmed by correlating the expert report's event dates with the Alpha Dancer's crew logs. Every single three-knock event occurred during a manned saturation rotation. 0 events during unmanned maintenance periods when the chamber was depressurized. Something knows when we're in there, and it wants our attention. The final surprise came 2 years ago, when a marine acoustics journal published a study on unexplained low-frequency signals in the North Sea. The researchers had been analyzing hydrophone data from a network of monitoring stations. At a location matching the Alba field coordinates, they detected a recurring acoustic signature. 3 pulses, evenly spaced, with a periodicity of 1.84 seconds. The signal had been present in every single year of data going back to 1994, 4 years before the Alpha Dancer was built. Whatever was knocking on the hull had been there before we arrived. Before the steel, before the drills, before the first human ever descended to that patch of seafloor. We hadn't found it. It had been there all along, and we'd lowered a pressurized chamber full of men directly on top of its home. I don't do reunion tour of the North Sea. I don't give motivational speeches about facing fear. I live quietly now, inland, far from any ocean. But every few months I get an email from someone who's read the Maritime Law Journal, who's seen the footnote, who wants to know if it's true. I tell them what I'm telling you. The knocking was never the worst part. The worst part was the 5 days after, sealed in that steel tube with nowhere to run, knowing something was out there that had been calling for years, and we'd finally started answering. And the truly terrifying thing, the detail that still wakes me up, is that the conversation isn't finished. The last recorded event on the Alpha Dancer was in 2015, 3 years after my rotation. 4 knocks, 1200 milliseconds, and then silence, not because it stopped, but because the company finally sealed that chamber permanently, citing structural concerns. They mothballed frame 47. They didn't want any more answers, but the thing that was knocking is still down there. And it's still waiting. And one day, someone else is going to knock back. We know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the deepest parts of our own oceans. That's a cliché, but like most clichés, it's true for a reason. The North Sea is 1,000 feet deep in places, cold enough to kill you in minutes without protection, and vast enough to swallow anything that doesn't want to be found. We send men down there in steel boxes to weld pipelines and repair wellheads, and we tell ourselves we've conquered the environment because we've engineered our way around the pressure and the cold. But we haven't conquered anything. We're visitors, uninvited ones. And the thing I learned from 11 years on the bottom is that the ocean doesn't care about your engineering. It doesn't care about your contracts or your safety protocols or your expert reports with their carefully worded footnotes. It will do what it does, and if something down there takes an interest in you, there's nothing in the manual that tells you how to respond. I think about the timekeeper a lot, not just the knocking itself, but the name. The crew who coined it knew something essential that the acoustics experts and the corporate lawyers missed. A timekeeper isn't a threat, it's a witness. It's something that marks the passage of moments, that counts the seconds, that waits. A timekeeper doesn't break down the door. It just lets you know that time is passing and that eventually time runs out. I don't believe the thing at frame 47 was hostile. If it wanted to harm us, it had 9 years of opportunities. It had divers in the water, umbilical hoses it could have severed, a chamber it could have damaged. It did none of that. It just knocked. 3 times. Then, when someone finally knocked back, it adjusted. It taught. It tried to communicate. And we responded by sedating the student and sealing the classroom. That's the real tragedy of this story. Not that something unknown exists in the deep ocean, but that we had a chance to learn what it was, and we chose not to. We chose profit and liability management over curiosity. We chose to bury a footnote rather than ask the biggest question a human being can ask. Who else is out there? The Alpha Dancer is still operating. The chamber at frame 47 is still sealed. The hydrophone network is still recording. Somewhere in a server room in Aberdeen, there are hard drives full of acoustic data that no one will ever analyze because the company has decided it's better not to know. But the ocean doesn't stop asking questions just because you stop listening. The knocks are still happening. I'm certain of that. And one day, someone else will hear them. Someone who hasn't signed a non-disclosure agreement. Someone who hasn't been trained to dismiss the unexplainable as thermal stress. Someone who will pick up a wrench, press it against the hull, and knock back 3 times. And this time, maybe the conversation will continue long enough for us to find out who's been waiting for us all along. If you've made it this far, thank you. These stories aren't easy to tell, and I know they're not easy to hear. If you want to support more deep dive investigations like this one, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The ocean is full of mysteries, and I'm not done talking about them yet.